Hello and welcome to part 2 in our series on the War in Heaven. Today we'll be diving into the beginning of the war and its early conflicts, paying particular attention to the two events named the Event and the Cataclysm. So without further ado, let's begin. Channeling the powers of the edifice, Compassion 5 once showed the 8th Doctor a vision of the Event. Frightful images of an enemy first strike on Gallifrey, boiling away the three oceans and levelling the great mountain ranges in the northern hemisphere until the planet burned and roiled and became a cinder. The Rivera manuscript detailed the Doctor's praxis-induced vision of the enemy's first attack on Gallifrey further. The enemy first attacked Gallifrey's new sphere, telepathically corrupting many Time Lords and overwhelming them with seizures and madness. The chapter houses of Gallifrey were then destroyed by black fireballs that materialized out of the sky, described as supercharged chunks of the causal nexus itself. At this time, a number of stolen TARDISes returned to Gallifrey, detonating on materialization. Enemy soldiers resembling Ashla shock troops, post-human cyborgs, materialized out of gouges in the sky, besieging the groups of survivors in their loom sheds for days, before plunging into the machinery of the breeding engines, detonating and leaving the looms intact, but mutated. Finally, the enemy neutralized the Eye of Harmony, and the entire planet vanished into Cataclysm. In the Doctor's vision, the surviving Time Lords decided to break their non-interference policy and retaliate by going back in time and razing the enemy battle worlds before the attack on Gallifrey occurred, preventing the event. The enemy erased this counterattack from history by detonating a Starkiller in the systems where the Gallifreyans had obtained the materials used to construct their fleet at a point before the materials had been mined. These strikes and counterstrikes continued and quickly spread into a full-blown war. Far into the war, at a time when the Time Lords were losing, details of the event and several other aspects of the start of the war were kept from the Gallifreyan public. On account of the mutation of the looms and use of black fire, this devastation of Gallifrey may have been the origin of the Kingdom of Beasts, an alter-time realm containing the devastated ruins of the Citadel following the War in Heaven. The kingdom was watched over by its corrupted Eye of Harmony, the Great Black Eye, and populated by the Malak, whom many speculated were mutated versions of the Time Lords. As several decades prior, the War King had prepared Gallifrey for the conflict, when it began it was not in a surprise attack by the enemy, but in a battle on Dronid, which they were prepared for. There was an attack on Gallifrey in the early days of the war, but it was nothing like the attack described in the Rivera manuscript. At a time far in the future of the war, Mathara's faction Paradox Warfleet decided to travel back in history to Romana III's Gallifrey shortly before the first enemy attack. They planned to take over Gallifrey, prepare for the event, and launch their own war against the enemy. The 8th Doctor decided to use the powers of the edifice to obliterate Gallifrey before the enemy could, destroying the faction and killing almost all of the Time Lords. Compassion 5, believing incorrectly that the enemy were Ancestor cells, believed that the destruction of the Time Lords at this time also prevented the enemy from maturing into a threat to the universe. However, she would go on to fight the enemy many times later in her life. And so ends the account that the war ended before it began at the hands of the 8th Doctor, essentially erasing itself despite powers from the future war meeting the Doctor earlier in his life. In many ways, the events that are coming up did happen, but were erased by the 8th Doctor or weren't, and instead lived on in another reality. All of this will be discussed at the end of the series in a separate entry on theories of the war and the identity of the enemy. After the fall of the Renegade Presidency, Dronid was littered with leftover time technology. As a result, it became the centre of the spiral underworld, with criminal organisations from across the lesser species flocking there to gather time technology. This became the first front of the enemy, who not only began gaining power, but also spread its deep-rooted philosophy. Not only did it gather support from other criminal organisations, the groups that tried to subdue its rising power did so by learning its methods, and so inadvertently spread its philosophy. Upon realizing this, the Time Lords tried and failed to retro-alter Dronid's timeline, but discovered it had been protected by the enemy. Instead, they tried to build their own power base on Dronid by planting an agent there to counter the enemy infiltration by subverting and controlling Faction Paradox's presence on the planet. However, this agent went native, and so they gained little ground. With it now obvious the battle would need to be fought on the ground, the Time Lords and their enemy began to aggressively ally themselves with other off-world groups. The enemy supplied its affiliates with greater and greater levels of time technology, but the Time Lords responded by co-opting larger and larger military units, including the Gabrielidine military. The first Type 90 TARDISes probed the perimeter of Dronid's new sphere days before the first battle began. 2 days before the Cataclysm, the Doctor attempted to make peace on Dronid, claiming that he had an old connection with one of the enemy's agents there. However, his acquaintance betrayed him, and he was thought to have died as the battle began. The Time Lord allies began the first battle by moving their warships into position around Dronid and bombarding the enemy power bases there. The enemy had prepared for this, but the bombardment activated the world processor engines that House Devora had installed in the planet's foundation after disposing of the renegade presidency. Locals were forced to take shelter in bunkers as a poisonous sky blew lethal, all-consuming clouds of spores throughout the streets. Compassion 5 may have been involved in the battle. Even 50 years after the Cataclysm, Dronid was still suffering the effects. Cults and criminal groups were the only government left. The Faction Paradox mission in Smithsman's Town owned one of the few automobiles to survive, but its bodywork had been eaten away by the Time Lord's clockwork bacteria. The Doctor's corpse, taking on the moniker of the Relic, was planted in the ruins of Dronid to make it appear that he had died during the battle. The Krotons managed to intercept a Time Lord relaying information from Dronid to the High Council. In their interrogation of him, they learned of the war and decided to try and gain technology from it to aid in their own war against the Metatraxi. Riots occurred on one Gallifrey at the start of the war, as civil unrest reached a breaking point. Shortly after the fighting began on Dronid, the fighting moved on to the Thousand-Year Battles, fought on Utterlost, Kaiwa, and Moandasa. Then the enemy attempted a direct attack on Gallifrey, which caught the Time Lords by surprise, and destroyed many technologies, including the Sash of Rassilon, the DMAT gun, and the Hand of Omega. However, thanks to the War King's preparations, the prophecies of Gallifrey's destruction were avoided. The war quickly became a four-dimensional series of strikes and counterstrikes, which Mr. Quixote described as a temporal stalemate. In the second year of the war, the faction took advantage of the confusion caused by it, and sent its remote shock troops to attack planets significant to the Time Lords, including Simia-KK-98. They hoped that Gallifrey wouldn't see any connection between them and the remote, but the Time Lords easily deduced that they were behind the attacks. In the initial phase of the conflict, planets such as Nebo were used as staging posts for Gallifreyan forces. Time engines were embedded into these planets to create pockets of reality outside normal space-time. The armies of the Time Lords, the enemy and Faction Paradox, fought great battles across the surface of Mercy, killing the 150 human colonists already living there. This came to an end when one of the powers changed history so that, 20 generations before the fighting, the Arbiterum bombed the planet with blacklight warheads, rendering it an inhospitable wasteland. Goral Shai of the First Wave was involved in many early battles of the war. The Ganda Nema campaigns, in which Godfather Shuk was captured, the rout of Wraithadween cultists, the Lamas 4 campaign, and the Spike, a conflict against the enemy over the Vault of Heaven. Soldiers of the Time Lords also fought a campaign on Aluthoa. In the fourth year of the war, the Time Lords began experiments in biological technologies, creating Regen-inf. They also became aware of the Remonstration Bureau. Enabled with Celestis technology, the enemy began using Anarchitects as weapons early in the war, viruses that could change atoms. In the fifth year of the war, the major powers of the war attempted to negotiate peace in the Venue Accords. The Accords lasted 1 picosecond and concluded that peace was an impossibility. The Book of the War summarized them as an agreement to disagree. In response to the failure of the Accords, the second wave of Gallifreyan military forces was created. On the Infernal Sphere, Baphomet obtained information on Thaumaktopus Memeticus's origins, leading him to be murdered by a T. Memeticus in the form of Thelema. The Daemons faced a private Gotterdammerung, with many of them dying in a gigantic battle mode. The faction unearthed a Daemon skeleton from Deimos and converted it into a warship. In the sixth year of the war, Devonire attempted to make peace between the Time Lords and Faction Paradox by finding Grandfather Paradox's missing arm. After a deal with the Maculata Formosion Kaiwa resulted in Devonire acquiring his own severed arm from the future, he was stricken with a severe case of paradox anxiety and imprisoned. Later in the 6th year of the war, the second wave underwent a successful campaign of sterilization against all of the planets where the faction had begun propagating the remote. The first planet sterilized was Ordifica in 2596. Mathara led an evacuation on the planet in the Justinian. Kreiner and Laura Tobin were among those on board. Mathara deposited the evacuees on the Time Lord superweapon Anathema in 1799, which was en route to destroy Earth in 1997. As the faction was busy retreating from the second wave, a pre-war era Babel hid within Isaac Newton's timeline and attempted to rewrite human history into a weapon against the enemy. Detecting that post-human civilization could be replaced with a constant sacrifice of fresh bodies and fresh blood in service of Gallifrey, the pilot's coterie used Praxis to send 3 pilots, including Erasmus, to the 17th century to recruit Nate Silver as an instrument to prevent the Babel's interference. A small faction mission led by Mother Sphinx became involved to ensure that the Gregorian Compact wasn't written out of history. They recruited Greenaway to spy on Silver. Larissa followed the Babel, and after an encounter with the faction hid within Afra Bren's timelines, the involved parties all gathered at Salaman's house in 1671, where the Babel escaped unharmed due to Larissa mistaking Silver to be the Babel's host. A second confrontation occurred in 1682, when the Babel attempted to install Silver as an immortal puppet leading the Service, a secret service within the British Empire of spies and cultists. Larissa stabbed Newton with her continuity needle, forcing out the Babel so it could be defeated by Erasmus. Silver stopped the needle from erasing Newton from history, and the faction conducted rituals to heal time. Circa the 6th year of the war, 46 years before the major breakout on Shada, the Blood coteries illegally manipulated the biodata of Demetra Kine and 4 shadow weapon-proof warriors, resulting in all 5 being imprisoned by the Time Lords. This was so they could get revenge against Shungkaka when Shada inevitably had a breakout. Sometime early in the war era, House Sarpexia conducted the Jungle Children experiment to see how Time Lord biodata would be changed by being raised by humans. Kaspar Hauser was placed in Nuremberg in 1828, but though Germany's timeline began to reshape around him, he was relatively unchanged. Shortly after Entaro Dara was brought into the project, the phenomena of temporarily displaced Hauserkinder, or Hauser children, became increasingly common during the war. In the 8th year of the war, the breakaway 13-Day Republic was founded by Anastasia Romanov, but quickly lost in the Battle of Valentine's Day. On Anathema, Mathara took Fitz Kreiner back with her to the 11th Day Empire, though he left behind a remembered version of himself. Kreiner quickly rose to the rank of father before being put in charge of one of the last remote colonies, shortly before it was cut off from the Empire. House Devora attempted to alter Earth's history by inspiring 16th century philosopher Giordano Bruno to become Pope and lead Europe into an early age of rationalism and science. Father Self subverted all of Devora's efforts and integrated Bruno into the remote of Anathema. After several generations had passed on Anathema, it arrived near Earth in 1997. The 8th Doctor, Sam Jones and Sarah Jane Smith, became involved with it and stopped it from fulfilling its purpose. The Doctor then took on Code and Compassion as companions, remembrances of Fitz and Tobin. While most of the remotes stayed on Anathema, some migrated to Earth, forming a small cult in 21st century California. A war veteran found asylum in the 11th Day Empire for a while, but they were eventually evicted as part of a faction paradox initiation competition led by Starch. Seol, formerly Kelsey Hooper, won said competition and became a cousin. Despite being involved in a cultural exchange with Theo Possible, Seol quickly tired of the faction and smuggled her biodata and consciousness into a new body, leaving her original to sign up for a faction mission to Moondasa and be wiped from history. Seol managed to evade the faction in her new body for a considerable period of time. In the 10th year of the war, Compassion met with the War King to form an alliance that entailed opening a second front against the enemy. Carmen Gay was present for this meeting, which she novelised in Fantastical Travels in an Infinite Universe. In the 11th year of the war, the third wave of Gallifreyan military was created. The last campaign of the second wave saw the usage of the last 3 remaining Babels against enemy forces on the planet Leth. The campaign ended when an unknown assassin, potentially a renegade Time Lord such as the Doctor or the Master, euthanized the Babel's lobotomized operators, and the Babels were torn apart on the battlefield. The Time Lords left the planet ravaged by time fracture. The 5th Doctor and Nyssa visited Leth and found a powerful Viridium staff there. In the 14th year of the war, The faction's 11-day empire was breached by the analytical engine of the Star Chamber, an English court within the Houses of Parliament associated with the service, and severely damaged the faction underground while it rebuilt the empire and re-evaluated itself. And that marks the end of the early conflicts of the war, with the introduction of the Third Wave marking the Time Lords' first excursion into higher biodiversity among themselves. In the next century we'll be going over further exploits in the war as the Time Lords began losing themselves to the conflict, as well as the introduction of Cwej and Sherlock Holmes. But anyway guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, then consider leaving a like and subscribing down below, as it really helps out the channel. And if you do subscribe, then make sure to click the little bell icon and turn on notifications so you're notified when the next part comes out. But as always, thanks for watching.